Here are the ancient Egyptian symbols of Saturn from various Egyptian zodiacs. We shall only cover the symbols of the primary horoscope so far. We see no drawings from the zodiacs of Petosiris. The matter is that Saturn, likewise a number of other planets, is drawn in a manner most peculiar for Egyptian astronomical symbolism, as waist-long portraits, which resemble each other to a great extent in case of Saturn and Jupiter. Therefore, the problem of their planetary identity had to be solved via sorting through all possible options and involved a large body of astronomical calculations. One sees 3 pictures of Saturn in Brooks' zodiac. This results from the fact that Brooks' zodiac contains 3 primary horoscopes at the same time. In the horoscope that was dated by Morozov, the name of Saturn is a demotic subscript. In the other 2, Saturn is presented as figures. The figure of Saturn is easy to recognize in the Egyptian zodiacs, since it possesses some distinctive traits. As a rule, a planetary figure from an Egyptian zodiac with a crescent on its head is Saturn. Another Egyptian attribute of Saturn is a hieroglyph of an ox or a bull near the head of the figure. In cases when one finds said attributes in a horoscope, it is easy enough to identify Saturn, and there is no confusion in the researcher camp. In other cases, we must choose from a variety of options. Let us linger on this for a while. The circles standing for zodiacs aren't shaded gray in 4 cases out of 7, which means that in 4 cases the figure of Saturn had been identified as such, prior to the astronomical calculations. We shall begin with these simpler cases. The 3 other cases are presented in the cells where the circles are shaded gray. These are more complex and we shall deal with these cases later. Let us study the zodiacs whose icons aren't shaded, starting with the large zodiacs from temples. Those are the round zodiac of Dendera, the long zodiac of Dendera and the zodiac from the greater temple of Esna. In each of those, we see virtually the same symbol with a planetary rod, a male figure with the face of an animal and a crescent on its head. We are using the word crescent, however, one could argue that it's not a crescent but, for example, bull's horns in the shape of a crescent. However, it is completely unimportant for astronomical dating whether or not the object in question is in fact a crescent. Next to the planetary figures with crescents on their heads, we see the same hieroglyphic inscription in both zodiacs from Dendera, which looks like a bull beneath a bird, with a star at the very bottom of the composition. Apropos, in the round zodiac, one sees another small hieroglyph that looks like a small square. According to the Egyptologists, it stands for a room or some other confined space. The translation of the entire inscription runs as, Horus the Bull, or Horus the Taurus. We aren't concerned with a precise translation at the moment. The important fact is that the repetition of the same description near 2 identical figures clearly shows that the figures in question refer to the same object. In this case, it is obviously a planet and not some other astronomical figure. This is confirmed by the rods in the hands of the figures under study. What planet could this be? The planet in question is Saturn. Near the planetary figure with a crescent on its head we see another similar figure in the round zodiac. However, it is a scythe and not a rod that it's holding in its hands. As it was already mentioned, the second figure pertains to one of the secondary horoscopes, and a rod isn't an obligatory attribute in its case. The scythe carried by the second figure is a well-known medieval symbol of Saturn. The scythe, which used to be a figure of death in medieval symbolism, is frequently found to be an attribute of the planet Saturn. Thus, the second figure that we see hold a planetary rod in the round zodiac, is also most likely to stand for the planet Saturn. A perfectly similar figure represents Saturn in the long zodiac of Dendera and the greater zodiac of Esna. Thus, a male planetary figure with a crescent on its head is a representation of Saturn. In the Athrabian zodiacs, Saturn looks like a bird with a crescent on its head. This identification results from a calculation that involves all possibilities. It corresponds with the identification of Saturn suggested for these zodiacs by the Egyptologists. Another zodiac with an unshaded circle is the zodiac of Brooks. The figure of Saturn is easy to identify before the calculations. In another horoscope that we find in Brooks' zodiac, the horoscope with boats, it is also easy to find Saturn, who is represented by exactly the same figure as we see in the zodiacs from Dendera, likewise the greater zodiac of Esna. It is the figure with the body of a man and the head of an animal, who stands in a boat with a planetary rod in his hand, and a crescent crowning his head. As for the horoscope without rods, the situation with identifying Saturn is somewhat more complicated. The issue is that one doesn't know a priori which of the four male figures represents Saturn. The figures have the respective heads of a jackal, a human, an ape, and a falcon. All four male figures are located near each other. Since all of them are male, they represent Saturn, Jupiter, Mercury and Mars. The remaining three planets don't fit, since Venus is a female, whereas the Sun and the Moon aren't drawn as human figures at all, as is the case in most other Egyptian zodiacs. Therefore, from the point of view of astronomical dating, the exact identity of each of the four adjacent figures in the horoscope under study is of minor importance. Astronomical calculations will eventually perform the casting of the four figures correctly. A more detailed account of this problem will be provided later. Let us simply cite the final solution here. Saturn is represented by the figure with a jackal's head. Identifying Saturn as the figure with a jackal's head is also logical from the perspective of Egyptian mythology. It is generally accepted that a jackal's head in Egyptian depictions represents the god Anubis. Anubis, the god of the dead, was revered either as a lying black jackal, as Sab the wild dog, or as a human figure with the head of a dog or jackal. Anubis was the principal deity of the underworld, and Saturn too was regarded as a god of the dead. On the other hand, it is presumed that the Egyptian god Anubis would be associated with Hermes by the Greeks, and the latter, in turn, was a double of the Roman Mercury. Thus, Anubis could stand for Mercury as well as Saturn, which is a possibility that was also accounted for. The calculations demonstrated that the jackal's head can indeed correspond to both Saturn and Mercury in Egyptian symbolism. For instance, in the greater zodiac of Esna, the figure of Mercury has the head of a jackal. It is most likely that Mercury has the head of a jackal in the Theban-colored zodiac, where Saturn has the head of an ibis. In the latter case, Saturn and Mercury prove to be very close to each other, according to the astronomical solution, which is what one also sees in the zodiac. Thus, astronomical calculations cannot help with the role distribution between the symbols of Saturn and Mercury in the OU zodiac. Thus, the issue of identifying the wayfarer with a jackal's head as a planet could be solved in a variety of ways. Morozov, in his account of the round zodiac of Dendera, tells us that the Egyptian Anubis with the head of a jackal used to symbolize Saturn. The Dictionary of Mythology, on the other hand, claims that the Egyptian Anubis corresponded to Mercury and not Saturn. This confusion might be partially explained by the following fact. It appears that there was another god in the ancient Egyptian pantheon, who was all but indistinguishable from Anubis in appearance. It is Seth, the god of destruction, the epitome of evil and the murderer of Osiris. Seth would also be drawn with a planetary rod in his hands, and therefore corresponded to some planet. His sinister qualities fit Saturn perfectly, and the names of the two resemble each other. In both illustrations, one sees that the Egyptian drawings of Anubis and Seth are near identical. It is possible that in order to make this similarity with Anubis less obvious, the Egyptologists evasively refer to Seth's head as to that of a monster. The Egyptians apparently drew a monster unknown to science. Seth is most likely to be Saturn with the head of a jackal, whereas Anubis is Mercury, also with the head of a jackal. Hence the similar heads and different names of these Egyptian deities. They stand for different planets. The same Egyptian figure with the head of a jackal is referred to as either Anubis or Seth, depending on the inscription next to it. However, this implies that the same symbol, a male figure with the head of a jackal, could be used in the ancient Egypt for referring to Saturn as well as Mercury. Jackal's head is not the only symbol that could be used for both Saturn and Mercury. The head of Ibis is another example. The name of the ancient Egyptian god with the head of an ibis is Thoth. It is presumed that the Egyptian Thoth, or ibis, corresponded to the Greek Hermes, or Mercury. Thus, according to the Egyptologists, Thoth can be identified as Mercury. However, it turns out that in some cases Thoth, or the ibis, would stand for Saturn and not Mercury in the Egyptian zodiacs. See the drawing of Saturn from the Lesser Zodiac of Esna, which was discovered as a result of astronomical calculations. It turns out that Saturn is represented by a procession of 3 male wayfarer figures carrying planetary rods. The 2 figures on the sides have ovine heads, while the one in the middle has the head of an ibis. Thus, we see Saturn drawn with the head of an ibis, and also that of a ram. We also see Saturn drawn with the head of an ibis in the colored zodiac of Thebes. This agrees well with the fact that, according to a number of researchers, Thoth and Seth used to be 2 names of the same ancient Egyptian god. Such ambiguity with the Egyptian Anubis Seth, jackal, and Thoth, ibis, which could stand for Mercury and Saturn, would invariably result in some confusion between the two in the ancient astral symbolism. Here are drawings of Jupiter from the primary horoscope as encountered in Egyptian zodiacs. If the circle is shaded gray, the discovery of Jupiter for the zodiac in question was made as a result of calculations involving different identification options. Otherwise, it was discovered during the preliminary stage of zodiac analysis. We see 3 different pictures of Jupiter in Brooks' zodiac. This results from the fact that there are 3 primary horoscopes in Brooks' zodiac. In the first one, we see Jupiter's name in Demotic script, whereas he's presented as human figures in the 2 others. In both the round and the long zodiacs of Dendera, Jupiter has got the same hieroglyphic subscript that looks like a bird over a long pair of horns with a circle inside. Brooks interpreted this inscription as Hor Opus Seta, which according to him, stands for planet Jupiter. All researchers of the zodiacs from Dendera were in agreement with Brooks' identification of Jupiter. Without going into further detail about the translation of the hieroglyphic inscriptions, it should be noted that this identification of Jupiter was in fact confirmed by studying the Egyptian zodiacs. The hieroglyph that looks like a pair of horns with a circle inside would also be drawn as a hat or a detail of Jupiter's headdress. This fact was discovered by the authors in the course of their study of the zodiacs. For instance, in the greater zodiac of Esna we see a pair of curved horns on the head of the last figure in Jupiter's procession with a circle between them. However, the drawing of Jupiter in the EB zodiac wasn't identified in advance. It took sorting through all possible options and extensive astronomical calculations. Similar undulated horns crown the head of Jupiter on the long zodiac of Dendera as well. They are complemented by 2 cobras and a tall hat, which precludes us from observing the similarity with the headdress from zodiac EB. Nevertheless, once observed, the similarity becomes obvious. The circle between the horns as a part of Jupiter's headdress can also be seen in the procession that depicts Jupiter in the lesser zodiac of Esna. Thus, a pair of horns with a circle in the middle is a frequently encountered attribute of Jupiter in the Egyptian astronomical symbolism. Another zodiac for which Jupiter was identified prior to the beginning of calculations is the zodiac of Brooks, accepting the horoscope without rods. In the demotic horoscope, the name of Jupiter is written next to that of Saturn in the two lines directed towards the head of Leo. Brooks is of the opinion that they're the names of the planets Saturn and Jupiter. In the end, we arrive at an astronomical solution that aligns perfectly with the solutions for the other two horoscopes of this zodiac. Therefore, Brooks' translation is apparently correct. In all the other zodiacs, Jupiter was found after sorting through a number of possible versions. In the zodiacs of Athribis, Jupiter is drawn as a bird with the head and the tail of a serpent. In the upper zodiac of Athribis, the bird that stands for Jupiter is in a very poor condition. The only part that didn't take much damage being one of the wings. It is therefore difficult to tell anything about how its tail and head are drawn. However, judging by how all the other planets are drawn identical in both zodiacs of Athribis, one may suggest that this Jupiter bird also had a serpent's head and tail. Identifying Jupiter was purely formal and based on computer calculations involving different versions. Here are drawings of Mars in the primary horoscopes of various zodiacs. One sees three different drawings of Mars from the zodiac of Brooks, since three primary zodiacs were discovered on it. In the first horoscope, the name of Mars is written in demotic script. This inscription was read and translated by Brooks. In the two other horoscopes, Mars is drawn as a male figure with the head of a falcon. Nearly all of the Egyptian drawings of Mars are similar, a male figure, usually on its own, with the head of a falcon. The Eb zodiac from the Greater Temple of Esna and the Athribis zodiacs are the only exceptions. In the zodiacs of Athribis, Mars is drawn as a bird with a long serpent-like tail. In the Greater Zodiac of Esna, there are no figures with falcon heads whatsoever. Here we see Mars as a man with a whip on his shoulder, holding a planetary rod. Identifying the lone male figure with the head of a falcon as Mars, is a tradition that originates in Brooks' interpretation of the hieroglyphic inscription found near this figure in the long zodiac of Dendera. Brooks read it as Hor-Tos and translated it as the red planet, or Mars, which is the only planet known for its red glow. Such identification of Mars in the long zodiac of Dendera was subsequently accepted by Morozov and all the other researchers of the Dendera zodiacs. Respectively, a similar figure was chosen as the representation of Mars on the round zodiac of Dendera. Here, we see it stand a little bit above Capricorn, almost on its back. The authors have adhered to this identification of Mars in the zodiacs of Dendera from the very start. This only concerns the figures of Mars found in the zodiacs of Dendera, Brooks' zodiac and the colored Theban zodiac OU. There were no other options for identifying Mars in these zodiacs. In all other cases, all possible identification options for Mars have been exhausted.